Over 2,000 years ago, I don't know if any of you were alive then, but over 2,000 years ago, we read that a small group of fishermen, of mothers, of fathers, of tax collectors, people who were confused, people who were afraid, were gathered in an upstairs room in Jerusalem. They were praying and they were waiting as Jesus, who'd been crucified and now was back to life, had told them to do. Wait, he'd said. And in a book called Acts, in Acts 2, we read that the Holy Spirit, who'd been promised, came and filled the place and the people in it. And we read that what looked like tongues of fire came to rest on each of their heads. The fire, if you like, was lit by the Spirit as it was poured out. Then we read a man called Peter went out, he stood up and he boldly started saying to the crowds, he started telling them about the world-changing, mind-blowing truth about the saving love and grace of Jesus. And he gave them an invitation. He gave them an invitation to receive that fire themselves, to be lit themselves. And we read that the Holy Spirit moved. And guess how many people gave their lives to Jesus that day? Anyone got any ideas? How many people became Christians that day? Any ideas over here? 5,000 we've got? 3,500. Any other guesses over here? Shout number, Ben.
3,512.
3,500. One at the back, Theo. 8,000. We read that 3,000 people, so very close, not so close, 3,000 people gave their lives to Jesus that day alone. And they added their fuel to the fire. Peter had gone out and he added his fuel to the fire of what God was doing. And God fanned into flame something more just through Peter adding his fuel to the fire. And then we read that more people encountered what Paul says in here were the extravagant dimensions of God's love as they repented and believed and began to live more like Jesus, reaching out and experiencing the breadth of God's love, testing its length, plumbing its depths, and rising to its height. They too were filled with the Holy Spirit, and they too were compelled to go and live full lives, sharing the goodness of Jesus. And they too started adding their fuel to the fire, and the fire continued to spread. 2,000 years later, you and I, we are now a part of that story. A group of people who've encountered the love of God and are learning to try and live more like Jesus and are learning to go filled with the Spirit and share the good news of Jesus, maybe in your school, maybe in your university, maybe in your workplace, wherever it is. And we're adding our fuel to the fire. And the fire, when we do that, can begin to spread. Now, the thing that really strikes me about this series that we've been doing on those verses from 2 Timothy is about how Paul says to Timothy, fan into flame the gift that God has given you. He doesn't say, now sit back, Timothy. God is going to fan into flame the gift of the Spirit in you. He says, no, Timothy, you fan into flame. God has lit the flame. But he says to Timothy, it's your job to add fuel to the fire of what I want to do in this world. You know, it's not until Moses takes a step of courage in the Old Testament, we looked at this last week, and adds his fuel to the fire, that something happens. St. Catherine of Siena, a famous saint back in the day, she wrote this: be who God made you to be, and you will set the world on fire. Be who God made you to be, and you will set the world on fire. So I just want you to think for a moment, who has God made you to be? What are some of the gifts that you have? What are some of the things that you are good at doing? What are some of the things you like doing for God? What is it that makes you you, that God has given you, that you can use to set the world on fire. Just have a bit of a think. You might want to chat to parents as well if you're a child, but just jot down on your kindling now, the thing we put our prayers on, just jot down. Be who God made you to be and you will set the world on fire. So just jot down, who has God made you to be? What is some of the fuel that God has given you that you can add to the fire? It might be a gift, it might be a talent, it might be an opportunity with the people that you see every day, it might be prayer, it might be finances. What has God given you that is unique to you that you can use to add fuel to the fire? Just jot that down now. Now, as a staff team about 15 of us went away last week, and we spent some time praying for you, praying for our church, praying for the city and for the county. And then during a break, we went into this lovely barn that had just been converted, and they'd got this lovely coffee machine there and some lovely sofas and a nice fire, and it was an amazing place to be. But in the corner of that room, it's going to come up on the screen now, there was this massive pair of bellows. It's about 4 foot tall, a pair of bellows, which they used to get fire going. Now, what I loved about seeing that pair of bellows is that for the last few weeks, we've, just as a bit of a visual prop, had these little pair of bellows here just to sort of make the point about fanning into flame. And we got to this retreat when we were praying that God would fan into flame things in this city, and they happen to be there. Now, you could say it was just a funny coincidence that those bellows were there. They're about this tall. But I think if it was God, I think, just maybe with a bit of a twinkle in his eye, but I think he was speaking to us as a church. Now, I realize I'm about to show my age with this next reference, but bear with me. One of the films that I loved growing up was a film called Crocodile Dundee. It was kind of an Australian Bear Grylls in the outback kind of thing. And there's a famous scene in Crocodile Dundee where he gets mugged. He gets mugged at knife point. And this guy's there threatening to kind of, saying, give me your stuff, I've got this knife. And Crocodile Dundee, he kind of reaches down into his belt and he goes, that's not a knife, this is a knife. And he pulls out this massive knife, and it's meant to be funny. I realise in telling it now, the kids are now scared, stiff, but there we go. It just reminded me, I felt like as we looked at those bellows, God was saying to us, like, these aren't bellows. That's not a pair of bellows. This is bellows. The things you think that I'm going to do, that's not it. This is what I'm going to do. The things you think I'm going to fan to flame, that's not what I'm going to fan to flame. This is what I'm going to fan into flame. And those verses we read in the NIV says, he's able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine according to his power. It doesn't stop there. According to his power, where that is at work within us. Not just his power, but his power that is at work within us. You see, God doesn't need you, but he chooses in his grace through Jesus to bring us into relationship with him, into his life, into his plans. Each one might feel as though we've just got a little bit of small kindling. Whatever it is you wrote down, you might feel that's just a bit of small kindling, and it's not going to make much difference to the fire that's being built. But as we add our fuel to the fire, God gets his bellows and grows it to immeasurably more than all we can ask or imagine. You see, it's not until Moses takes a step of courage and adds his fuel to the fire just by raising his staff. But it's at that point that God parts the Red Sea. It's not until Joshua takes a step of courage and adds his fuel to the fire by putting on his boots and marching around a city, but that's when God brings the city walls down. It's not until the widow adds her fuel to the fire by beginning to pour just the last bit of oil she has left. But as she does so, the oil keeps on coming until every vessel she has is filled. It's not until Peter takes a step of courage and adds his fuel to the fire by sharing his faith that 3,000 people then come to know Jesus. And it's not until one student takes a step of courage and invites his mate to Alpha, that his mate then becomes a Christian, and within a year, 3 other people have come to Alpha as a result and become Christians. And it's not until one person and then another takes a step of courage and gives generously, and another person volunteers their time to be a delivery driver, and another person goes, you know what, I'm really good at software, I'll help you put together a spreadsheet that will help you manage the stock of food that you're now collecting in for Love Your Neighbour. And before you know it, what started off as a few people giving a bit of time has actually become something that over the nation is now serving over 1 million people and helping them in food poverty. All because a few people put their kindling on the fire, added just their fuel to the fire, and God fanned into flame something even more. It's not until a church takes a step of courage to add their fuel to the fire, sending out their best people, resources that they can't afford, and actually sees a church beginning to be planted in Grimsby. We don't know what God's going to do through that yet, but we do know people are invited on Alpha this week, and we do know they've last Sunday had over double the number of people they started with, and we do know God is going to do immeasurably more. Now, I don't know how God is going to resource. I don't know how God is going to do it, but by adding our fuel to the fire, we can continue to see this city changed by the love of God. By inviting your friends to the light party or kids' cell where they can meet Jesus, this city will change. By inviting people to ask questions and come to Alpha, this city will change. By joining Love Your Neighbour, not just to show God's love in action, but to show them there's hope by introducing them to Jesus, this city will change. By having the courage to pray for one another and look out for one another as church family, this city will change. By fueling the fire to get upstairs ready, whether through DIY skills or fundraising skills or creative problem solving skills, it'll make a difference to this city. And in the weeks that follow this, we're going to be looking more at how you can discover the gifts you have and fan them into flame. But today, we only do this twice a year. I just want to focus in a bit on how we might use our money as a way of resourcing the vision here to make, as Paul says, the extraordinary plan of God known. Now, the reality of where we're up to as a church is currently this year we're looking at a £36,000 deficit, which is likely to be repeated again next year. I've written to many of you during the weeks. If you haven't gotten that letter and want to know more detail, please come speak to me afterwards. But we'd love you, if you haven't already, just to read that letter, because we just want to be open and transparent about where we are. Now, whilst I won't lie, a deficit of £36,000 does give me the occasional sleepless night, it does actually excite me as well, because the reality is we can frantically do that, but it ain't going to cut the mustard. And so it's going to need God with his bellows to do immeasurably more. And that's what excites me, because I can't see how humanly it is possible. But there is an invitation for each one of us. And it's not actually about the size of the log or the kindling that we bring. It's not actually about the amount that we might give. It's not really about finances at all. It's simply about, in response to the love and generosity of God and the purposes he has for us, bringing our fuel to the fire, however insignificant it may seem to you, and knowing that as we do that, we don't need to pump away, tiring ourselves out, but that God will come and fan something into flame. It's knowing that as we raise our staff, as we walk around the walls, as we pour out our oil, as we offer our packed lunch, as we open our mouths and give of our resources, which are all a gift from God anyway, that God will do the rest. I don't know how he'll do it, and I suspect it will look very different to what we might expect. After all, who would have expected when Moses rose his stick to see a sea part? Who would have expected walls to fall down when someone walked around them? Who would have expected 5,000 people to be fed as just one little boy brings his packed lunch? But I do know, because we've seen it over the last 7 years, that each one of us bringing our little bit of fuel and adding it to the fire is all it takes, and God will work out the rest. And so that's the invitation this morning. I'd love us just to spend a moment just praying, just asking Father, what's our fuel? Particularly financially this morning, what's our fuel? What might he want us to give? Like I say, we only do this twice a year. We don't ask you for your money every week, but it's important. It's part of our worship and responding to God that we do it. So in a moment, I'm just going to lead us in a prayer. Josh is going to lead us in a song. And during that song, can I just invite you just to be open to God and just say the prayer, God, fan into flame the gift of God that is on me.